The woman who owned a billion-dollar company spent that night sitting alone in her car because she had nowhere left that felt like home. Charlotte Hayes had spent 12 years building a technology empire, yet on a cold October evening on Route 31 inches western Pennsylvania, none of that mattered. The board had voted to suspend her. Her phone rang, but she silenced it. Then the engine died. Dozens of cars passed without stopping. Finally, a battered blue pickup pulled over. A tall black man stepped out into the rain and walked toward her. Not rushing, not demanding, just kind. He stopped beside her window and offered a small wave. Charlotte rolled the glass down slightly. Cool air drifted inside, carrying the scent of wet earth and autumn leaves. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of someone who did not need attention to feel important. Charlotte managed a tired smile. "Looks that way." He nodded once. "Mind if I take a look?" She studied him for a moment. There was something different about him. No arrogance, no agenda, just quiet dignity, the kind that had become rare in her world. "I would appreciate that," she said. He extended his hand. "I am Ethan Walker." She shook it. His grip was firm, but gentle. "Charlotte." He crouched beside the disabled SUV, while rain drummed across the highway. His flashlight beam moved carefully through the engine compartment as Charlotte stood beneath the open hood. "Fuel pump relay," Ethan said after a few minutes. "Nothing major, but I do not have the part tonight." Charlotte sighed quietly. In another life, she would have called an assistant or a private service team. She would have had 3 people solving this problem before she finished the sentence. Tonight, there was nobody. Not because nobody existed, but because nobody she trusted remained. "How long until I can get one?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the dark horizon. "Probably morning. I tried the auto shop in Derry, but they close at 9. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain softened into a mist that drifted across the roadside fields. Somewhere beyond the trees, a church bell rang the hour. Ethan closed the hood gently. "There is a motel about 15 miles east, but honestly, it is not much of a place." Charlotte smiled faintly. "You are really selling the area," Ethan chuckled. "Just trying to tell the truth." Then another pair of headlights appeared. A small school bus with fading yellow stripes slowed beside them. The passenger door opened, and a young girl leaned toward the window. "Dad, are you fixing another car?" Ethan smiled. "Looks like I am trying to." The girl noticed Charlotte. "Hi, I am Sophie." Sophie was 8 years old with warm brown skin and braids pulled back with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. She studied Charlotte with the honest curiosity only children possess. "You look sad." Ethan sighed softly. "Sophie." "What?" "She does." Charlotte looked away, but she was not offended. The child was right. Sophie disappeared inside the bus and emerged, carrying a folded umbrella, nearly as large as she was. She handed it to Charlotte. People should not stand in the rain when they are already having a bad day. Charlotte felt a tightness in her throat. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Sorry. She has always said exactly what she thinks." "Do not apologize," Charlotte replied quietly. "It is refreshing." Finally, Ethan glanced toward the road leading to town. "Sophie and I were heading home for dinner. If you want, you can wait there until morning." Charlotte shook her head. "I could not impose. You would not be." "We have spaghetti," Sophie added, "and garlic bread if Dad did not burn it again." Ethan laughed. 1 time, 3 times. Charlotte found herself smiling for the first time all day. Not the practice smile she used during interviews or shareholder meetings, not the smile she wore in photographs that appeared in magazines, a real one. Small, but genuine. The drive took less than 15 minutes, but for Charlotte it felt like crossing into a different world. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle by the time they turned onto a narrow gravel road lined with maple trees glowing gold beneath scattered porch lights. Sophie sat in the back seat talking non-stop about school, her favorite teacher, and a stray orange cat that kept stealing food from their porch. Ethan listened with the patience of a man who had heard every story before and still enjoyed hearing them again. Charlotte found herself smiling quietly as she watched them from the passenger seat. There was a rhythm between father and daughter, a quiet grace built from years of shared struggles and small victories that required no audience. When they pulled into the driveway, Charlotte saw a modest white house with a wraparound porch and flower boxes beneath the windows. Nothing about it was expensive, yet warm light spilled from the kitchen windows into the darkness like an invitation. Sophie raced toward the front door. "Last one inside has to do dishes." "That is not an actual rule," Ethan called after her. "It should be." Inside, the house smelled of garlic, baked bread, and something sweeter she could not quite identify. Family, she thought. It smelled like family. Framed photographs covered one wall. Sophie, at different ages. School plays, fishing trips, birthday cakes. One picture showed Ethan kneeling beside a bicycle while a much younger Sophie grinned proudly without training wheels. Charlotte paused longer than she intended. Every photograph carried something she had not seen in years. Presence. Real, unhurried presence. She had spent most of her adult life racing toward the next goal, the next acquisition, the next quarterly report. She had won awards for leadership and been profiled in magazines for innovation. But not one of those accomplishments had ever looked back at her, the way these photographs looked at the people in them. "Dad burns toast, but he makes great spaghetti," Sophie informed her. "Thank you for lowering expectations before dinner," Ethan replied. They sat around a worn wooden table beneath a light fixture that had been repaired more than once. The meal was simple: spaghetti, garlic bread, and iced tea. Yet as conversation drifted from favorite movies to school stories, Charlotte realized she could not remember the last time she had shared a meal without checking her phone. Her phone rested silently inside her purse. For once, she did not want to look at it. Then Sophie tilted her head. "So, what do you do for work?" Charlotte hesitated. "Lately, I am not really sure." Sophie nodded, as if that made perfect sense. After dinner, Sophie returned holding a sheet of paper covered in crayons. She placed it in front of Charlotte. 3 people standing in front of a small house. One was Ethan. One was Sophie. The third had long blonde hair. "Is this me?" Charlotte asked. Sophie nodded. "You looked lonely, so I put you in our picture." The kitchen became silent. Ethan opened his mouth to apologize, but Charlotte shook her head, her eyes fixed on the drawing. In boardrooms, people saw a CEO. In newspapers, people saw wealth. But a child had looked at her for less than 3 hours and somehow noticed the loneliness she had spent years trying to hide. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered. Sophie hugged her father, then surprised everyone by hugging Charlotte too before disappearing upstairs. Charlotte remained at the table holding the drawing. For the first time in years, she wished the night would last a little longer, because this small house contained something her penthouse and her company had never been able to give her. A place where she felt seen. Charlotte barely slept that night. The guest room was quiet, the mattress comfortable, and the rain had finally stopped after midnight. Yet her mind refused to rest. She sat beside the window holding Sophie's drawing. 3 people in front of a small house. Such a simple picture. Such a powerful truth. At 6 the next morning, pale sunlight spilled across the fields. Charlotte walked downstairs expecting an empty kitchen. Instead, she found Ethan at the stove making pancakes while country music played from an old radio. "Morning," he said. "Did you sleep at all?" Charlotte smiled. "Not much. You and me both." Sophie appeared a few minutes later, wearing mismatched socks and carrying a backpack nearly as large as she was. "You are still here," she said happily. "I am. Good." Ethan placed a plate on the table. "Breakfast first, school after." For the next 20 minutes, Charlotte watched a scene so ordinary, it felt extraordinary. Ethan reminding Sophie to finish her orange juice. Sophie pretending not to hear. Ethan finding her missing homework folder exactly where she had left it. The small routines of a family, the small acts of love that nobody applauded and nobody posted online. After breakfast, Ethan drove Sophie to school while Charlotte remained behind. The house felt strangely empty without them. Strange because she had lived alone in a penthouse for years and never noticed the emptiness. But this was different. This house was built to hold people, and when they left, their absence had shape and weight. She wandered into the living room and noticed a stack of bills on a side table, a worn sofa, scuffed floors, a bookshelf filled with children's paperbacks and repair manuals. Signs of a life lived carefully, not desperately, just carefully. The kind of careful that came not from poverty, but from dignity, from a man who paid every bill on time and never asked for anything he had not earned. Her phone vibrated. This time she answered. "Charlotte," a voice said immediately. It was her chief legal officer. "Thank goodness. Everyone is looking for you." Charlotte closed her eyes. "I know. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. Reporters are calling every 10 minutes. Investors are nervous. The stock dropped 4% yesterday." Charlotte listened quietly. The words that once would have sent adrenaline through her veins now sounded like a language she was slowly forgetting. Only 24 hours earlier, she would have rushed to fix everything. Now she stared out the window toward the empty driveway. "Where are you?" the lawyer asked. Charlotte hesitated. "Somewhere peaceful." The line went silent. "Charlotte, this is serious." "I know." "Then come back." Charlotte thanked him politely and ended the call. She stepped onto the front porch. The autumn air felt crisp and clean. Across the road, a farmer drove a tractor through a field, glowing gold beneath the morning sun. No cameras, no shareholders, no headlines, just life. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to ask a question she had spent too long avoiding. If success had given her everything she thought she wanted, why had she felt so empty? An hour later, Ethan returned. He found Charlotte on the porch steps watching leaves drift through the air. "Everything okay?" he asked. Charlotte looked up and offered a small smile. "I think I am starting to figure something out." Ethan sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance. Neither spoke for a while. The silence felt comfortable, honest, and somewhere deep inside Charlotte Hayes, a decision she did not yet fully understand was quietly beginning to take shape. The rest of the day passed more quickly than Charlotte expected. She helped Ethan replace a section of fence near the garden while Sophie was at school, hammering nails and holding boards steady while he measured and cut. The work was simple and repetitive, and Charlotte discovered that she liked it. There was something honest about building a thing you could touch, something that stayed where you put it and did not require a quarterly review. They shared lunch on the back porch, sandwiches made with bread that was slightly too thick and mustard that was slightly too strong. And Charlotte could not remember the last meal she had enjoyed this much. Ethan told stories about Sophie learning to ride a bicycle and insisting she could do everything by herself. He laughed when he described how she had fallen 7 times in a row, each time getting up and announcing, "I meant to do that." Charlotte felt something loosen inside her chest, something she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. When Sophie came home from school, she found Charlotte sitting on the porch and immediately sat beside her, leaning against her arm as if they had known each other for years. Charlotte put the book she had been reading on the railing and listened, while Sophie recounted every detail of her day with the breathless urgency of someone who believed every moment mattered. She described a science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda that had gone spectacularly wrong, and a boy named Marcus who still could not tie his shoes even though he was the tallest kid in class. And Charlotte laughed in a way that came from somewhere she had not visited in a very long time. By late afternoon, her vehicle had been repaired at a nearby shop, and reality began knocking at the door again. Her phone continued buzzing with messages she did not want to read. When the time finally came to leave, Sophie wrapped her arms around Charlotte without hesitation. "You will come back, right?" she asked, her beads clicking as she looked up. Charlotte smiled. "Maybe. That means yes," Sophie declared confidently. Ethan laughed. Apparently she speaks fluent grown-up. As Charlotte climbed into her vehicle, she looked back at the small house one last time. The porch light glowed softly in the evening air. Ethan stood beside Sophie, both waving as she pulled away. For reasons she could not explain, leaving felt harder than it should have. The rearview mirror held their image long after she should have stopped looking. On the way out of town, Charlotte stopped at a gas station. The attendant, a thin man in a faded cap, glanced in the direction she had come from and asked casually, "You staying out at Ethan Walker's place?" Charlotte looked at him. "Excuse me?" "Just making conversation," he said, sliding her receipt across the counter. "Not too many folks from outside come through that part of town, is all." His tone was not hostile. His smile was not unkind. But there was something underneath both, a quiet line drawn between this side of the road and that side, a geography that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with who lived where and what color they happened to be. Charlotte did not respond. She paid and pulled onto the highway, but the man's words stayed with her for every mile of the drive back, settling into a place she could not quite name, somewhere between discomfort and recognition, as if she had just brushed against a wall that had always been there but she had never been asked to notice. 2 hours later, she arrived at her penthouse, overlooking downtown Pittsburgh. The elevator doors opened to polished marble floors, designer furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view worth millions. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Perfect, immaculate, empty. Charlotte set her keys on the counter and stood in the center of her kitchen, waiting to feel something. Relief, maybe. Familiarity, comfort. Nothing came. The silence felt different here. Heavy, cold. Not the kind that rested between two people who did not need to fill it, but the kind that pressed against your chest and reminded you that you were alone. She walked through rooms larger than Ethan's entire house and felt absolutely nothing. The living room had been staged by a designer who never asked what Charlotte actually liked. The bedroom held a bed she had slept in fewer than 100 nights in the past year. The dining table could seat 12, and she could not remember the last time anyone had sat across from her at it. Every surface was clean. Every object was placed with intention. And none of it had ever once made her feel at home. She stood at the window and looked down at the street far below, watching strangers walk past each other beneath umbrellas without acknowledgement, and she thought about how Ethan waved to every car that passed his driveway whether he knew the driver or not. She thought about Sophie's laughter filling a kitchen that smelled of garlic and bread. She thought about how a house could be small and full at the same time, and how an apartment could be enormous and completely empty. Then her eyes landed on Sophie's drawing resting on top of her suitcase. 3 people standing in front of a small house. "You looked lonely, so I put you in our picture." The words echoed through her mind as she lowered herself onto the couch and stared out at the city lights below. Thousands of people, thousands of windows, thousands of stories unfolding behind glass. Yet she had never felt more alone. Her phone rang again. This time it was the chairman of the board. She let it ring. Then came another call, another message, another demand. Charlotte turned the device off completely. For the first time in years, she chose silence over obligation. She barely slept. Before sunrise, she stood in her walk-in closet, looking at rows of expensive clothes hanging in perfect order. Suits that cost more than Ethan's truck, dresses she had worn once to events she could no longer remember, heels that had never touched gravel. None of them felt like her anymore. She left the designer bags in the closet. She left the jewelry in its velvet boxes. She packed a single suitcase, jeans, sweaters, comfortable shoes, nothing else. Then she picked up Sophie's drawing and placed it carefully inside, between 2 folded shirts where it would not crease. By 7, she was driving back toward the small town. The farther she traveled from the city, the easier it became to breathe. Golden morning sunlight spilled across the rolling hills as she turned onto the familiar gravel road. Her heart pounded harder with every passing second. What was she doing? She had no plan, no strategy, no exit scenario. She was not entirely sure. All she knew was that she had spent years building a life that looked successful from the outside, while feeling empty on the inside. And somewhere between a rain-soaked highway and a child's crayon drawing, something had shifted inside her that could not be undone. When she reached the house, Ethan was carrying a toolbox across the driveway. He froze when he saw her vehicle. Charlotte stepped out holding the handle of a suitcase. For a moment, neither spoke. The morning air felt perfectly still, as if the entire world had paused to watch what would happen next. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out across the fields and received no answer. Ethan glanced from her face to the suitcase and back again. Charlotte smiled nervously, something she had not done in years. Not in front of investors. Not in front of cameras. Not in front of anyone who might mistake vulnerability for weakness. Then she took a slow breath and said the words that had traveled with her from the city. I was hoping you meant it. The night before she had left, they had been sitting on the porch steps watching the stars. Sophie had already gone to bed. The house had settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, the dishwasher humming, floorboards creaking upstairs as Sophie moved between rooms. The conversation had drifted into silence, the comfortable kind that felt like a room you never wanted to leave. Ethan had been looking at the sky when he turned to her and said, almost offhandedly, "You know, you could always just move in with us." He had smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that lives exactly between a joke and a confession. Charlotte had laughed. Neither of them had mentioned it again, but the words had followed her into the guest room that night, into her car the next morning, and through every mile of highway between this porch and her penthouse. They had been waiting for her in the silence of her empty apartment, and in the space between the city lights where no warmth lived. Now she was standing in his driveway with a suitcase and a heartbeat she could feel in her throat. The morning sun was warm on her face. The air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke from a distant chimney. Everything about this place felt real in a way that her life in the city never had. Ethan stared at her for several seconds. The toolbox hung from one hand, as if he had forgotten he was holding it. "You drove all the way back here," he finally said. Charlotte nodded. "I did." Ethan set the toolbox down slowly. He looked toward the house, then back at her. "Charlotte, I was joking." "I know." A faint smile touched her lips. Most people would have laughed and moved on. She paused. "Most people are not me." Before Ethan could respond, the familiar yellow school bus appeared at the end of the road. Moments later, Sophie jumped off and started running toward the house. Then she saw Charlotte. She stopped so suddenly her backpack nearly swung past her shoulders. "You came back!" she shouted. Charlotte barely had time to react before Sophie crashed into her with a hug, so fierce it nearly knocked the suitcase from her hand. Sophie's beads clicked against Charlotte's coat as she squeezed tighter, her small arms holding on, as if she were afraid Charlotte might disappear again. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face and laughed. The kind of laugh that carried surprise and warmth and something close to wonder. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess that settles the vote." For a moment, the three of them stood in the driveway, morning light falling through the maple trees, and something unspoken passed between the two adults. Not a promise. Not yet, but the quiet understanding that this was no longer an accident. It was a choice, and choices, unlike accidents, carry weight that does not wash away with the rain. The next few days felt strange and surprisingly natural at the same time. Charlotte took the guest room again. She helped make breakfast every morning, learning where the spatula lived and which burner ran hot. She walked Sophie to the bus stop, learning which cracks in the sidewalk Sophie always jumped over and which mailbox she tapped twice for good luck. She accompanied Ethan into town, where he worked at a local garage that smelled of motor oil and decades of honest labor. Nobody recognized her. Nobody asked about stock prices or quarterly earnings. To the people in town, she was simply Charlotte, the woman staying with Ethan and Sophie. The simplicity felt almost unreal, like stepping into a photograph of someone else's life and discovering it fit better than her own. For the first time in 12 years, she went entire days without anyone asking her to make a decision that affected thousands of people. The relief was so enormous, she almost did not recognize it as relief. One afternoon, Charlotte stood inside the garage handing Ethan tools while he worked beneath the hood of a pickup truck. Grease stained his hands. Country music played softly through an old radio mounted on the wall. The air smelled of motor oil and coffee, and the particular warmth that comes from a space where someone has worked hard for a long time. "You are smiling," Ethan said without looking up. "Am I?" More than before. Charlotte leaned against the workbench. "Maybe I forgot how." Ethan glanced toward her. "People do not forget how to smile. They just stopped giving themselves permission. The words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. That afternoon, Charlotte and Sophie walked to the grocery store together. Sophie held Charlotte's hand as they crossed the parking lot, her braids swinging and beads clicking with each step. Inside the store, they moved through the aisles slowly, Sophie pointing out her favorite cereal and explaining in great detail why chocolate milk was scientifically superior to regular milk. Charlotte was laughing at Sophie's increasingly elaborate argument when a middle-aged woman in a pressed blouse and pearl earrings stopped beside them. The woman looked at Charlotte, then down at Sophie, then at their joined hands. Her eyes performed a calculation that took less than 2 seconds but contained a lifetime of assumption. "Are you her nanny?" the woman asked, her voice coated in a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. Sophie's hand tightened around Charlotte's fingers. Charlotte felt the grip and something turned cold inside her chest, but her face remained perfectly still. She had faced hostile boardrooms, aggressive investors, and reporters hunting for weakness. None of them had ever made her feel quite like this. "I am her family," Charlotte said. The words came out calm, steady, and final. The woman smiled thinly and walked away, but her gaze lingered a beat too long, as if she were filing something away for later conversation at a place where Charlotte and Sophie would never be invited. On the walk home, Sophie was unusually quiet. After 2 blocks of silence, Sophie spoke softly without looking up. "People look at me and Dad like that sometimes. I am used to it." Charlotte stopped walking. She crouched down until she was eye level with Sophie. Sophie's eyes were steady but held something no 8-year-old should have to carry. "You should not have to be used to that," Charlotte said quietly. "Nobody should." Sophie looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if Charlotte had just confirmed something she had always suspected but never heard spoken aloud. Charlotte took Sophie's hand again, and they walked the rest of the way home in silence. But it was not the heavy kind. It was the kind of silence that follows understanding, the kind that does not need to be filled because everything important has already been said. It was the silence of 2 people who understood each other a little better than they had that morning. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan and Charlotte sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the fields. The night air was cool and still. Crickets hummed in the tall grass beyond the driveway. For a while, neither spoke. The kind of silence that once made Charlotte anxious now felt like a gift. A space where nothing was expected and nothing was owed. Then Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked out across the darkness. "When I bought this house," he said quietly, 3 neighbors sent letters to the town council within the first month. Nobody used the word race. Nobody had to. The complaints were always about property values, unfamiliar presence, concerns about the character of the neighborhood. He paused. One woman came to the door with a pie. I thought she was welcoming us. She said she was worried about Sophie playing outside without supervision. Sophie was standing right there on the porch holding my hand. He shook his head slowly. I kept every letter. Not because I was angry. Because I wanted Sophie to understand someday that the walls people build are not always made of wood or stone. Some of them are invisible, and those are the hardest ones to tear down, because the people who build them never admit they exist. Charlotte listened without interrupting. His voice was calm, almost practiced, the steadiness of a man who had fought this battle so many times that he had learned to conserve his energy for what mattered most: his daughter, his home, his dignity, not his pride, which was loud, his dignity, which was quiet. "You handled it better than I would have," Charlotte said after a long silence. Ethan shook his head. "I did not handle it. I survived it. There is a difference." The words settled between them like stones, dropped into still water. Charlotte stared at the sky and felt something shifting inside her. The world she had built, the one made of glass towers and shareholder meetings, had never required her to see these walls. They had always been there. She had simply never been asked to stand on the other side. She thought about the gas station attendant and his careful phrasing. She thought about the woman in the grocery store who looked at Sophie's brown skin and Charlotte's white skin and saw a transaction instead of love. She thought about how easy it had been for her entire life to never think about any of this at all. Ethan turned toward her. You still have not told me what you actually do." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. She nearly told him everything: the company, the board, the magazine covers, the billions. Then headlights appeared at the end of the road. One vehicle, then another, then a third. Black SUVs moved slowly toward the house, like a convoy that did not belong on a gravel road in rural Pennsylvania. Charlotte's expression changed instantly. Ethan noticed. "Friends of yours?" Charlotte did not answer. The vehicles rolled into the driveway and stopped. Men and women in business attire stepped out carrying briefcases and tablets, their shoes crunching awkwardly on the gravel as if the ground itself was foreign. One older man in a charcoal overcoat approached the porch. "Miss Hayes," he called. "We have been trying to find you for 3 days." Ethan's brow furrowed. Hayes. The name carried weight he could not yet place. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning. Every major network is covering this story. The shareholders are demanding answers." Silence settled across the porch like a physical thing. Ethan slowly turned toward Charlotte. For the first time since the night they met, he was looking at her not with curiosity, but with realization. And in that moment, the secret she had tried so hard to leave behind finally arrived at his front door. The porch fell into a silence so deep that even the night insects seemed to hesitate. The black SUVs idled in the driveway, with their headlights cutting across the wooden steps like harsh white lines drawn through a peaceful painting. Charlotte stood first, her hands slowly lowering from the railing. Ethan remained beside her, his posture still, but no longer relaxed. The older man stepped forward again. "Miss Hayes, we need to speak with you immediately. The board has scheduled an emergency executive session. Shareholders are requesting your return within 24 hours. Charlotte turned slightly, her voice calm but distant. "Not tonight." The man hesitated. "This cannot wait." Ethan finally spoke, his tone steady but firm. She said not tonight. The man glanced at Ethan, measuring him briefly, before turning back to Charlotte. "With respect, this is a matter involving billions of dollars in assets and corporate governance." Ethan exhaled slowly as if trying to process a reality that did not belong in his world. "So that is who you are," he said quietly. Charlotte did not deny it. Instead, she looked toward the top of the stairs, where Sophie had appeared, holding her stuffed bear, sensing the tension without understanding it. "Can you go upstairs for a few minutes, sweetheart?" Charlotte said gently. Sophie nodded and disappeared. Once she was gone, Charlotte stepped down from the porch. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she walked toward the driveway. The executives formed a loose semicircle, holding tablets and folders, waiting for direction as if the entire economy depended on her next sentence. Ethan watched from the porch. He had spent his whole life in rooms where he was the only person who looked like him. He recognized the posture of people who believed their world was the only one that mattered. One of them spoke quickly. "The board believes your absence has created instability. They are prepared to vote on interim replacement authority tomorrow morning." Charlotte was about to respond when she noticed something that stopped her mid-breath. One of the younger executives, a man in a tailored navy suit, was looking past her toward the house. His eyes moved from the peeling paint on the porch railing to the gravel driveway to the pickup truck, and finally to Ethan, who stood with his arms crossed at the top of the steps. Charlotte had seen that look before, at the gas station. In the grocery store aisle, it was the look of someone measuring a man not by who he was, but by what he looked like standing in a place they had already decided he did not belong. Charlotte turned to face the group. Her voice dropped to a register that every person in that driveway recognized, the tone she used in boardrooms before someone lost their position. "If any of you have a problem with where I am standing, or who I am standing with, the doors of your vehicles are still open." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence was absolute. Charlotte held the gaze of the young executive until he looked away. Then she turned back toward the porch. Ethan had not moved, but something in his expression had shifted. Not surprise, not gratitude. Something quieter and more permanent, the look of a man who had just watched someone choose to stand on his side of the wall without being asked and without hesitation. "I am sorry you had to find out this way," Charlotte said softly. Ethan shook his head. I do not understand all of it yet. He paused and looked at her the way he might look at something he had just found and was not sure he was allowed to keep. But I do not care what you own, Charlotte. I care who you are. The words settled over the porch like something warm and permanent. Behind them, the executives waited in the cold. The night air outside Ethan's house felt heavier than before, as if the entire world was waiting for Charlotte Hayes to make a decision that could not be undone. The executives stood near their vehicles in careful silence, representing a life built from numbers, contracts, and expectations that never stopped demanding more. Ethan remained on the porch steps, watching Charlotte with a calm that did not pressure her, but also did not retreat. Charlotte looked from the driveway back to the warm glow of the house, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all. She could hear Sophie moving upstairs, the faint sound of bare feet on wooden floors, the quiet rhythm of a child who felt safe enough to move through her own home without worry. In her mind, she saw two versions of herself standing in different directions. One was a woman in a glass tower, surrounded by endless meetings and pressure that never slept. The other was standing barefoot in a kitchen, with a child who drew her into family pictures without asking permission, and a man who had endured invisible walls his entire life and still chose kindness over bitterness. One of the executives spoke carefully, reminding her that the board meeting would begin at sunrise, that every major investor was already aligned for a decision that could permanently change the structure of her company. Another reminded her that stepping away now would be seen as surrender, that the financial press would frame it as weakness, and that competitors would use the moment to gain ground. Charlotte listened to every word without interruption. Then she slowly raised her hand, signaling them to stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan took a step forward, but did not speak. He did not try to influence her choice. He simply waited the way he had waited through every quiet battle this town had ever asked him to fight. Charlotte exhaled slowly, as if releasing years of air she'd been holding without realizing it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but softer than anyone had ever heard it in a boardroom. She said she understood the company. She understood the responsibility, and she understood the cost of walking away. But she also said she had spent her entire life building something that looked powerful, while forgetting what it meant to feel alive inside it. Not one person in 12 years of boardrooms had ever looked at her the way a child with colorful beads in her braids had looked at her on a rainy road and said, "You look sad." The executives shifted uncomfortably, but Charlotte turned fully toward them and said she would not be returning to the city tonight, or tomorrow, or in any timeline that required her to abandon what she had found here. She told them to proceed with whatever temporary leadership they believed necessary, because for the first time in her life, she was choosing something that could not be measured in stock value or market reaction. Ethan did not smile, but something in his expression softened, as if he finally understood that her presence was not a mistake or a temporary escape, but a choice made with full awareness of everything she was leaving behind. Charlotte walked slowly back toward the porch, passing Ethan until she stood beneath the warm light from the doorway. She looked back once at the driveway filled with expensive vehicles and people waiting for answers they would not receive tonight. Then she stepped inside the house, where Sophie's laughter still echoed faintly from upstairs. Ethan followed her in, closing the door quietly behind them. And in that moment, there was no announcement, no grand declaration, and no applause. Only the simple sound of a home continuing to exist as Charlotte Hayes chose not the empire she had built, but the quiet place where she had finally been seen. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.